Hello and welcome to UWO Now. I'm your host, Wendell Ray. UWO Now is the podcast where we talk about interesting and relevant topics with the students, staff, and faculty at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. Today, we've got a very interesting topic. It was in February of 2022 when Russian forces invaded Ukraine. And since then, billions of dollars in support from the United States and NATO have poured into Ukraine. Sanctions and other penalties have targeted Russia and its oligarchs. But let's take a step back so that we can literally understand what in the world is going on and why it should matter to us here. Joining us today is Dr. Tracy Slagter, a professor in the Department of Political Science and a faculty advisor of the award-winning Model Nations team at UWO Oshkosh. Thanks so much for joining us here today, Tracy. Good to see you.
Likewise, it's a pleasure.
Tell us about who you are, how you got to UWO, and how you got to be, why you chose this particular subject matter to concentrate on.
Yeah, so I finished my PhD at the University of Iowa in 2006, and I had applied for a bunch of different jobs and was lucky enough to get the job here. And my husband and my family and I, we have fallen in love with Oshkosh, and we've stayed ever since. The university has been a really fun place to build a career. And I have an awesome department. That is one of the things that I think is definitely maybe rare in academia. My department is really supportive, and they're fun, and I love them. And I can't imagine doing this job without them. But no, I started in political science. I think I got the bug when I was a sophomore in high school. I was taking a bunch of AP courses. I'm originally from Brainerd, Minnesota. I took an AP course in comparative government and loved it, and decided pretty much. I had talked to my high school teacher, and I said, how do you do this, at the university level? And he said, well, here's what you need to do. And I said, all right, that's what I'm gonna do. And I did. And politics is intensely interesting. It's a part of literally every aspect of our lives, but people don't tend to think of it that way. Like, of course, it's part of gas prices. Of course, it's part of, foreign policy, but it's part of the food that you eat. It's part of literally everything that you do. And so it became to me something that is just this sort of driving passion that I can connect to everything. And I also really love sharing that with students so that they can see, sort of have this veil pulled up and say, like, literally everything that you're doing has a political dimension. Let's figure out why. Let's figure out how you can change it if you want to do that, or maintain a status quo if that's what you want to do. Like, you need to know how it works. I study international politics, comparative politics, which essentially means I study all the countries except the United States, which makes it really, really interesting. My specialty is the European Union. And, when we're talking about the conflict with Ukraine, that is obviously really, really front and center. I always thought that I was going to study international organizations. I thought I was going to study the UN primarily. And through a very odd kind of twist of fate, I now do, because I am one of the faculty advisors for the Model UN team. But I primarily study international law, international criminal law, so crimes against humanity, war crimes, those sorts of things, and the European Union. But through my career at the university, I've been encouraged and I don't know, asked to teach in a wide array of fields. So environmental politics is something I do. I teach a class on the politics of food. I mean, we have a small department that is, I think, stretched to do the things that we think are important. And we're allowed to do those things, which is kind of awesome.
You mentioned the Model Nations team here at UWO, doing great things this past semester in the spring of 2022.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. What exactly is that Model Nations team? What do they do? How do they compete? How do they prepare? What's your role in all of that?
Well, Model United Nations is, I would say, like the ultimate learning experience for students. It is essentially about the art of compromise and negotiation. And so students, through taking on the sort of perspective of other countries, we usually always play an African country or a really small country, they really get a chance to explore how do you find agreement in large groups of people representing other countries that, maybe have very, very different interests, very, very, very different identities from you, right? And different sort of power relationships from what you have. So it's a chance for students to build those skills of negotiation, compromise, oral communication, written communication. In a Model UN competition, we're throwing students into rooms of college students and saying, organize yourselves and figure out a way that you can reach some sort of compromise within a span of this 5-day conference. And
how are they judged? How do you decide that they did a better job of negotiating an issue compared to X school?
Well, our team, our sort of claim to fame is that we always come in armed with a whole lot of knowledge. Our team is incredibly well prepared. So not only on just how do you negotiate, how do you talk to other people, but how do you write a position paper? How do you write a speech? Not like those are all things that we can teach, right? But getting all of the background knowledge, they know the UN really, really well. They know foundational documents depending on the issue they're talking about. They might be talking about improvised explosive devices. They might be talking about climate change. They might be talking about indigenous rights. There are a whole host of things that our students need to know. And our team has been marked by a willingness to really dive in and gain that expertise. And what I think is the most impressive about all of that is that they're doing it and they don't get academic credit for it. It's not a class.
Oh.
Right? So the university has been amazing in supporting them, and they do great things. But you asked how they're judged. They're judged on their ability to bring a large group of people together. So during these conferences, you have people who are leading the conferences who are circling hotel ballrooms because there will be hundreds of students in each of these rooms representing different countries, right? The less than 200 countries of the UN. And what they're looking for are people who have this art of negotiation and of bringing people together and of forging compromise. They're looking for those people. And we've been really fortunate in that UWO Oshkosh students have sort of a recognized talent in doing that. We practice a lot those types of skills to ensure that students, when they get to those conferences, they stand out, right? They're well prepared, they're well spoken. They have tactics to bring, and in an authentic way, to bring people together and forge compromises. That's a skill that you learn. That's not just something like, well, I'm just good at that, right? That's a skill that you practice. And all of those skills that we teach and practice in Model UN are actually skills that we teach and practice in every course in the university.
That's right. And
also in your life, right? Someday you're going to have to buy a car, you're going to have to buy a house, you're going to have to negotiate a raise, you're going to have to figure out all of these things. It really helps if you have the skills necessary to be like the nice, informed, firm person who can bring parties with differing interests and differing backgrounds together to reach something that's mutually, you want everybody to walk away happy.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about power. It's not about, slamming you down so that I get more. It's about making sure that we come to a mutually beneficial agreement. And that's hard.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm your host, Wendell Ray, and today we're talking with Dr. Tracy Slagter, who is with the Political Science Department at UWO. UWO Now is an opportunity for us to talk to people like Tracy and other students, staff, and faculty at UWO about interesting and relevant topics in the world. Before we move on to what's going on with the Ukraine and with Russia and the war there, let's talk about how successful that United Nations team here was last semester. I mentioned that and kind of prepped it, but tell us exactly how they did last year, because it is a competition and there are many teams from across the nation represented.
From across the world.
Oh, across
it's an
the world.
international conference.
Tell us how they did.
Yeah, they did spectacularly well. Sort of the highest honor that you can get as a delegation, that would mean representatives of a single country, is you can get the Outstanding Delegation Award. And this means that across, a whole host of different topics that the UN addresses. We were representing, for example, Botswana, whether it was in an environmental room, sort of the United Nations Environmental Assembly, or whether it was in the General Assembly First Committee, which deals more with security and political issues. Your whole team has to be kind of on the same page and having a leading role in bringing people together and fostering compromise. And if you sort of are at the scoring enough points across your whole delegation, you can win the Outstanding Delegation Award. And we did for our Botswana delegation. We also had a smaller delegation of mostly first-year students that was representing Singapore. And they didn't win an Outstanding Delegation Award, but they won so many other awards, just like the Outstanding Delegate Award. Like they were recognized for doing these other things. And these were students who had just joined Model UN.
Oh, wow.
Like they were first-year students, and now they're going to form the backbone of our team. And I just couldn't be happier. Like the enthusiasm that students have when they join this team, they realize that they're getting not only expertise and skills, like, oh, that's super important, right? But more important than that is they're gaining a team, right? And everybody has everybody else's back, and you have to work together. And it becomes a really close-knit, it has been for decades, a really close-knit organization. And our alums from Model UN are incredibly supportive and active. We've got alums who literally follow our progress at competitions and are messaging me like, how are they doing? And when I stepped into this role in 2018, I did not think that that's what was going to happen. But I've been super impressed and humbled by the legacy of the team and their ability to work really hard and, to do it all for the love of it.
How big is the team?
The team really varies in size. Right now, we're small. We had a lot of students graduate. So right now, we're probably hovering at around 10. So we're going to be doing recruitment. So if anybody wants to join.
What's the number? I know how many a basketball team ought to have, how many a football team ought to have.
Yeah.
How many members ideally would you like to have on Model Nations?
I'd like to have 25 to 30. Because then I can have our students representing more than one country at the national conference. We can do it with a small team. But it's really more fun if we can do it with a slightly larger team. We get to go to St. Louis. We get to go to New York City. In November of 2023, we're going to be competing at our very first ever international conference in Germany.
Wow.
So there's a lot of exciting things, and we'll be at Titan Fest, and we're really excited to have a couple of new people join.
Okay. And the idea is to have enough so that you can have multiple nations represented, or have teams representing multiple nations and do negotiations that way. That's fantastic. Yeah. And these students use those skills, as you said, not just for degree purposes, but in life. So it's beneficial all the way around. So that's great.
I was just talking to a pair of alums who are now married, Model UN alums.
Talk about negotiating.
It happens, right?
Yeah.
And just a couple of weeks ago, and they've been out since, 2012 maybe, and they're doing really well in their careers. But they said they still, anytime they go up for a job interview or promotion, they still bring up their Model UN experience because it was just so formative, right? And there's really not another experience that I can think of that, hits all of our essential learning outcomes of the university in quite the same way. So I just get super excited about it, as you can tell, because I feel like it's just such an amazing way to serve students and to really showcase what they can do when they're when they're firing on all cylinders. It's amazing. And I think this past year in particular, when we were in New York City, it was just so wonderful to see them transform from, college students wearing sweatpants and leggings on the bus and on the plane. And then they're all in suits and ties and, skirts and super professional in the span of an hour. And especially as we're coming out of COVID, to see them all at this conference where they were doing their thing and so happy to be doing it, it was just, it was just amazing.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm your host, Wendell Ray, and today our guest is Dr. Tracy Slagter. She is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the UWO Oshkosh campus. We've been talking so far about Model Nations, but we're going to transition in a second to talk about what's going on in the Russo-Ukrainian war and why that is important to everybody in the United States. Of course, NATO is heavily involved in supporting the Ukrainian side. But before we move into that, we needed to kind of finish up some stuff with Model Nations.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that, one of the great things about this Model UN team is the level of university support that we receive. So not only am I one of the faculty advisors, not only do we have the support of the chancellor's office and the provost's office and so many people and the foundation who help us to do anything that we do. I'm lucky enough that I have a co-advisor, Dr. Ange Sabulwa in International Studies. She's the director of International Studies. We could not do this on our own. It's just a lot.
Team to handle. Yeah, you need some multiple coaches.
Exactly, exactly. And Ange, we almost always we almost always represent African countries.
And why is that?
There are a lot of reasons, but you remember how I said, like, you want to get a big group of people on your side, right? Okay. Like when you're at these conferences, you want to build a big coalition or a big caucus, right? And Africa has 54 states, right? Okay. So if you can find an issue that is important to all African countries, well, there are 54 of them, so that you sort of can have this kind of built-in, Africa's really diverse and really different. Northern Africa and Southern Africa are really different, but you might be able to hit on issues that would be relevant to all of them. So it's kind of a nice starting point. And Ange is an Africanist, right? She studies African politics. Okay. She studies Zambia. She studies refugee politics. She's just an amazing scholar. So it's really great. And I feel really, really fortunate to have someone like her who is sort of my other half in this team.
Well, we're fortunate to have you here with us today to help us break down what's going on in Ukraine. In February of 2022, as I mentioned at the start of the program today, Russia invaded Ukrainian space. Now, many people may think that's when the war started, but this is something that's been going on for really decades. Tell us what we ought to know about what is happening in that part of the country and how we got to where we are today.
It's a long, complicated story that I would largely defer to my historian colleagues to give you all the details. But the sort of short answer to this is not a new conflict. This is not something that just emerged on February 24th of 2022. You may recall even just a few years ago in 2014, where Russia under Vladimir Putin annexed the Crimea, right? The Crimean Peninsula, which is part of Ukraine. It is sovereign Ukrainian territory. And he basically just took it.
Militarily?
Well, pretty much militarily, yeah, right? There's a whole contingent of Russian forces that are in eastern Ukraine that have been there, have been threatening eastern Ukraine since that time and maybe even before then, right? So this is not new. This is not even, I don't know if I want to say that it was expected, but Russia was not going to let this go. Russia was always pretty clear that they wanted more. And I think when the international community didn't really respond to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and a whole host of other things, we really didn't respond to Russian aggression and support in Syria, where a whole other conflict has been brewing for over a decade now.
What's the connection there?
Well, Syria is another really complicated conflict, right? Where you have essentially what is a civil war. With backing from major powers like the United States, like Russia, bring the Iranians in, bring the Israelis, bring everybody into that. And the United States and Russia are always on opposite sides there, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
The Russians have supported Bashar al-Assad, who is the dictator of Syria. And they've committed some pretty incredibly bad atrocities in Syria, and we've just sort of let it go, right?
And when we say, not to get too deep into the weeds here, but when we say that Russia has supported Syria, we mean
supported their dictator.
Similarly, how we are supporting Ukraine, that is militarily, politically, how have they shown support to Syria?
Well, if we just think of the United Nations, Russia has always blocked any sort of attempt by the United Nations to intervene meaningfully in Syria to end that conflict, or at least try to mitigate that conflict. It was a brutal, brutal war, right? Putin, Russia under Putin, we could say that he's actively trying to destabilize not only that region by supporting a dictator in Syria, but also by destabilizing the region and sending, hundreds of thousands of refugees to Europe. That's really destabilizing. That's what he wants. I think at the end of the day, what Putin wants to do and what we've sort of allowed him to show is, Western liberal democracies, they they don't have it, right? They're not going to come and act in any sort of meaningful way. And so when you had that happen in 2014, you've had it happen in Syria, and we have other instances of this as well. I think it's just emboldened someone like Putin. But what I think is super interesting about the current conflict is, to a certain degree, the West is resurgent, right? Western liberal democracy, I think people have seen how fragile democracy is and how it needs to be supported. I mean, we've seen that in the United States, right, with the fragility of American democracy and the insurrection and all sorts of attacks on American democracy, election interference by Russia, right? Yeah. They see it in Western Europe with election interference. They see it in the destabilization of having whole, thousands and thousands of refugees come. Like, none of this happens just on accident, right? These are calculated moves, and they're part of a, I think, broader context of kind of the West versus autocracy, right? And we talk about that in this country now, just talking about like comparing ourselves to Russia, of course, right? But also comparing ourselves to China. China's not a democracy. They don't pretend to be a democracy. They don't want to be a democracy, right? So if democracy is truly something worth defending, worth protecting, worth dying for, well, then what's that line? It wasn't Syria, right? It wasn't Crimea. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's the whole of Ukraine. And I think you've seen that movement against autocracy, against Putin, trying to isolate him through these unprecedented sanctions, through the strengthening of NATO, through a whole host of, all the support financially, militarily that the United States has given, that other Western European countries have given, and the sort of isolation of Russia to say, like, no, this is not the way that the world works. And I can see, Putin, right, that you are attempting to change the narrative here, and this isn't it. There's a liberal democratic order. This is how the world works, and we're going to fight for it.
And we also should know, I guess, and take a look at who Putin is and how he views Russia, and that Russia, there was at one time a Soviet Union, and now there is not. And some of those former members of the Soviet Union are now members of NATO, and there has been this increasing creeping into what was formerly kind of a no NATO zone, if you will. But we've got all these, you got Poland and Latvia and many other nations close to Russia that are now NATO nations. And so Putin, feeling a little anxious,
a little crowded,
has said, hey, look, slow your roll a little bit there, and let's try, or if you don't, I could act militarily. And that's been kind of what, from what I understand, has been happening since the mid-90s.
Oh, for sure, right? So you have the breakup of the Soviet Union, which, we just had the death of Mikhail Gorbachev, who didn't intend for the Soviet Union to end, but it did under his watch, right? Because he tried to sort of liberalize the Soviet Union to make it more competitive. But you had, I think, Putin comes to power not too long after the Soviet Union is no more, after it's completely dissolved. And I think there's always been this kind of historical legacy of Russia as much bigger than what it currently is. And this idea that Putin likely has that, there is a union of sort of Slavic people and they're sort of guided by Russia, and we should get the band back together, right? So I think it's irksome to him, for sure, that many of those countries that you mentioned are NATO members. It might be more, or at least equally as irksome to him, that so many of them are European Union member countries now. Because then they're firmly, if you're going to join the European Union, you have to sign on the dotted line and say, like, we're committed to liberal democracy and free market capitalism and all these things, right? And the respect for the rule of law and respect for human rights and all this business. So I think it is threatening to him, but I think there are many ways we can understand Putin insofar as we can understand what goes on inside anybody's head, right?
Right.
And in political science, we think of, conflicts. We have multiple different explanations for why conflicts happen when they do, right? You could say, well, there's a power imbalance, right? And that, when the war started, everybody thought, myself included, like, this is going to be short, like Russia is overwhelming in its sort of military might, and it just didn't happen. Because I think another explanation for conflict, which is, to my mind, more powerful here, is one of identity. And Putin wants to tell the Ukrainians, like, you don't exist. You don't have an identity separate from us. We're all really Russians, right? Which is why he wants to take over and has taken over those parts of Eastern Ukraine and tried to make them into Russians and vote for Russians and, not speak Ukrainian and all of these things, right? And I don't think the world was quite prepared for this Ukrainian identity that was so clear and so focused in a way that I don't think people necessarily expected, and so committed to a future of an independent Ukraine that it's just tremendously inspiring. And so there's that identity bit that has proven stronger. I mean, now we see Ukrainian forces pushing Russian forces back. Like, that's not something in February 2022 that anybody would have thought would have happened. Nobody would have thought that Kyiv would still be around, right? And it's there. And the Ukrainians are holding, and they have the support of most of the world behind them, right? Most of the sort of democratic world, at least, behind them. And also, an increasingly powerful umbrella of NATO that should at least worry someone like Putin, right? Now, especially, having Sweden and Finland join, right? They've
neutral for so long.
Oh, yeah. And they've been encouraged to join before, but they're like, nah, we don't need it, right? Well, to get them on board is amazing, right? To have the European Union move really quickly on giving Ukraine candidate status in the EU, this is a process that does not move this fast ever, right? And to have Ukraine already as a candidate country for EU membership, that's crazy. Like, I've never seen it happen before. And so I think what this conflict represents and why it's just so fascinating and so critical is it represents this real flashpoint for democracy in my mind, right? Like, here is a chance for us as believers in democracy, right? Really put that to the test. How much do you believe in it?
Yeah.
Are you going to fight for it? Are you going to put your money behind it? Are you going to make sure that we can, we can support Ukraine meaningfully, and not just with our words and, good wishes, but support them to defeat, the Russians who want, Putin wants the exact opposite of what we want. He wants full control. He's an authoritarian ruler. That's not what we want.
So we talk about this complexity with all this. It's a real life scary Game of Thrones going on here, but for the person listening nearby, they may understand it, but why do I really need to be interested in what's happening there? Mm-hmm. How is this really does it or will it impact my life? And not just us, but you can say that for the folks in Europe too. Yeah. I think we see that in terms of how Russia is manipulating energy sources. But what about the folks here? Mm-hmm. How are we, or why should we be paying attention to what's happening there?
You're already seeing the impacts of it. It's already impacting your life. I mean, we have inflation in this country, and it's tempting to think that inflation is just something that we can manage here on our own. Mm-hmm. It's not. There's inflation all over the world. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of distortion happening now because of the conflict in Ukraine. So none of these things, as I've said, right, happen in a vacuum. I think, I think there's a lot.
Real quickly.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? So, what's the impact of what's happening here mm-hmm. on inflation? Or not
happening there on inflation?
Here, yes.
Well, I think you have a lot of things that are happening. First of all, we've had the almost complete isolation of one big economy, right, through the sanctions that have been levied against Russia. I mean, that has been a distortion, mm-hmm. right? But I think too. we're paying higher prices because we don't have as many goods. Why do we not have as many goods? Because supply chains have been disrupted. Why are supply chains being disrupted? Well, because there's a war going on.
And
right?
The whole premise of inflation is there's more demand than there is supply.
Exactly. And so, while it's tempting, I think, in the United States, we tend to be really insular and say, well, this is a problem and we'll fix it. Well, there's only so much that our government can do to fix this. It's not fixable just on our own, right? As so many problems are that we face right now, something like climate change, for example, right? These are not problems that we can fix anymore. They take concerted global action. And so I think you've seen attempts to do that, attempts to bring down inflation. We just passed this Inflation Reduction Act, which was a major sort of milestone. But I think, when your average ordinary citizen is thinking like, how does Ukraine impact me? I think they're already seeing it in their bills. I think it's going to be something that people should be thinking about when they think about, heading to the ballot box in November, right? A lot of our money the government is spending is going to Ukraine. Why are we spending that money? Well, we're spending that money because we're trying to defend something that we believe in. What do we believe in? We believe in the values of democracy, right? And we know that that's fragile. We also know that democracy has been something that is contested here, even in the United States, in a way that it never has been before. So I think in some ways, when I think about this conflict, I think about how it looks kind of in the broad scheme of world politics, right? And like, what are the times or the moments at which you can say something has fundamentally shifted here? Now we're in a whole new landscape. And I think maybe the last time that really happened was the end of the Cold War, right? So when the Soviet Union collapsed and you had all of those countries of, former Eastern Europe becoming democracies or some semblance of democracies. Like that was a real change. It organized politics for us. And I think maybe what we're seeing here with this conflict in Ukraine is a shift kind of like that, kind of like the global defense of democracy. And even in the United States, we don't always agree on what that should look like. But I think we can agree that it's important.
Yeah.
We can agree that we're feeling the effects, that the whole world is feeling the effects. And we can see people coming together in support of Ukraine in a way that I certainly didn't anticipate in this way. I mean, I anticipated there was going to be some sort of like circle the wagons, but not in this really passionate way, because people are seeing it for what it is, which is a direct confrontation between sort of the Western liberal democratic order and the forces of authoritarianism.
And again, Ukraine is just not some, small nation in terms of its economic impact on the rest of the world, because are they the largest producer of grain?
They're one of, yeah.
One of. So they're one of the largest countries in Europe. A lot of people, and so that impacts the global economy.
I mean, and it's just coming. Like there are so many things that are coming together at the same time that I think demand our attention and demand action and demand it now, right? So we've got Ukraine, which, as you say, is a huge supplier of grain, particularly to areas of the world that need it the most, right? Places in the Middle East, places like Yemen, where there's already a massive conflict brewing, right? That not even brewing, it's been going on, right? So the most vulnerable countries are now at risk of not having enough to eat. So we've got famine conditions, we've got starvation, right? And that's in part as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's why it was such a momentous thing when those cargo ships loaded with Ukrainian grain were actually able to get out. That's huge, right? But I think when you think of this conflict, then add onto it other big things that are happening, right? Really severe impacts of climate change. Europe in a massive drought, a historic drought.
Yeah.
The massive flooding in places like Pakistan, right? China also being impacted by climate change, right? Not to even mention the heat that is coming to the United States. All of these things are destabilizing, right? And none of them can be tackled alone. They can't, right? So I think in some ways, I like to think of it this way. Maybe it's just because I'm an optimist, right? That this is something kind of shakes Americans out of our typical, like, we can do it ourselves. We can handle this by ourselves and we're good at it, right? We are. We're a great country. But the types of problems that we have been facing and that are certainly coming to a head right now are problems that demand concerted action now, right? Climate change can't wait. Ukraine can't wait. Those are types, pandemic type diseases can't wait. And it's not enough for one country to do its best. It's not enough. You have to have concerted action and you have to have it more quickly. And I think we're finally starting to see that. But it's like the conflict in Ukraine sort of brings everything into sharper focus. It's like it's that conflict on which all of these other conflicts are now stacked. It impacts everything. Everything is interconnected.
Dr. Tracy Slagter, thanks so much for coming by and talking to us today. It's really good meeting you, and thanks for sharing all the information with us.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to UWO Now. Remember to always check for new episodes of UWO Now, or simply click on the RSS feed to stay current with the latest episode of UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray. Until the next time.